Welcome to Missing the Mark, where we look for meaning in strange places. I'm Christopher. Today I'd like to look briefly at what you might call a weakness in skepticism. Now, recently, Armored Skeptic did a video, which I've seen an awful lot of people say is quite bad. And I'm not going to say it's good. But there's a key part in it I think a bunch of people have quoted, and I'm going to quote for my purposes, and this is going to be out of context.
See what I did there? I debated Chris's position. I used skepticism to counter his arguments.
Now, to be clear, in the original context, he's arguing that you should not simply dismiss a person's argument because he sounds kind of like somebody you don't like. You should actually hear them out, see what they have to say, and address what they actually said. And that's a perfectly good point. So what I'm saying here is not in any way meant to be a criticism of Armored Skeptic's video itself. In context, what he said makes at least a reasonable amount of sense, and his point is a decent one. However, the thing that he used to buttress his point is representative, I think, of something I've seen in a lot of cases, and I think is actually a good way of looking at why his video has been so badly received by a lot of people. Not everybody, obviously, but by a lot. And that is, in particular, skepticism, in the modern sense of doubting rather than the more ancient sense, which is a more well-developed philosophy, is, by virtue of being a purely negative thing, completely unsatisfying. Because as the criticism I've seen a lot of Armored Skeptic's video is that he doesn't really say anything. He is constantly mentioning, well, it is possible that something or other, someone could do something. And you see this actually a lot in academic papers too. A lot of academic papers, if you read them carefully and pay attention to all the qualifiers, have made no actual claims. All they've ever stated is that things are possible or could be done, but they've never actually claimed anything. Which stands in great contrast, actually, to if you read the style guide by Strunk and White for how to write. It's really interesting that they advise taking these things out, because in general, reasonable people know that you don't mean everything as universal declarations. And granted, they wrote that before the internet. They also took out, mentioned taking out things like, in my opinion, to soften things. Everyone knows it's in your opinion, was their argument. If you stated it, we know that it's what you think. We know that it's your opinion. So don't bother telling us. Now, people throw those things in to soften. And there's a lot of that. You know, you could tell that Armored Skeptic didn't want to offend people. And he suffers from, I forget who said it, but essentially, like, the problem with fence sitting is that it leaves you with a sore crotch. And there's some truth to that, and you sort of get that sense. But there's a fundamental weakness in the skeptical approach, which is that his arguments, as he gave, and if you watch the video, the arguments essentially amount to, they have to do with things about population, but they're all of the form, well, it's possible that, or it could be the case that, or it doesn't, it isn't necessarily so. And those are all extremely weak, because you can always say about everything, but maybe it isn't true. Or, and again, about everything, well, but maybe it is true. Well, yeah, you can only say that. It's always possible in some, theoretical, logical sense that some condition about the world is true or some condition about the world is false. So merely saying about something, well, maybe it's not true, well, so what? You haven't added anything. Everyone already knew it was always possible to say, well, maybe it isn't true about it. And, or the reverse, because, you can always just say, like, well, maybe it isn't not the case. And so this is sort of the problem that skepticism leads to. It doesn't produce anything positive, and you need positive things in order to live life. At some point, in order to do so much as pick up a sandwich, you have to not be a skeptic and say, like, well, maybe I shouldn't eat this sandwich. Well, maybe you shouldn't, but at some point, you got to actually just commit and do something, even though, well, maybe it's not the best idea. And so, this is where, of course, people who are purely skeptics in the modern sense tend to run into a lot of problems because they only ever develop a theory of what not to believe. They only develop a theory of how to say, well, maybe it isn't so. They never develop any sort of rigorous idea of what to actually affirm. So it leads to, I saw one person who was into sort of a more hardcore version of skepticism, making fun of less hardcore skeptics who defined the less hardcore skeptics version of skepticism as rigorously doubting whatever it is they don't want to believe in. And and then not at all applying this to, the things they do in fact want to believe in. And that's not a very workable philosophy. I mean, that's not a very workable approach. I mean, it works in the sense of you can do it, and you get results that you like in a certain sort of sense, but you don't get results that you have any particular reason to believe are true, because what you just happen to like is not a good guide to truth, as anyone over the age of about 8 knows. So that's where skepticism really falls down, is it doesn't train people in what to accept. Because, of course, you can always just say, well, maybe it's not true about everything. But figuring out how to build up what actually is true, what is most likely to be true, and so on, is something that takes actual work and takes actual training. And that's why, in a sense, the skeptics are the worst people in the world to talk to find out what is true. Because doubting is really easy, but figuring out what's true is the hard part. So, and I think people in, the skeptical community, skeptics more generally, and teenagers often do this too, of all kinds, are often accused, and I think somewhat justly, of trying to score points by simply taking the easy route that, destruction is much easier than building things up. But it is nonetheless true that destruction is a lot easier than building things up. And if a person only ever works on their skepticism, because frankly, skepticism is a good idea, it's just, it's the unrigorously applied skepticism that's a problem. Because the partial skeptics that the skeptic I mentioned earlier made fun of are really the people who are doing it wrong, because they're being somewhat skeptical, but then they're just letting it go on some things, so they're not being consistent with it. If you actually take skepticism seriously and are genuinely skeptical of everything, including yourself and including your skepticism, it then, it makes you more resistant to certain types of bad ideas. But at the same time, many of those bad ideas are the very things that you kind of want to believe, the things that help you to get along with all your neighbors, that make you fit in with the group. Those are things that you should be somewhat skeptical about. And it's something that you see a lot of people who talk about skepticism generally aren't. They aren't skeptical of the things that make them fit in with their friends. They aren't skeptical of the things that make them comfortable. They're only skeptical of the things that make them uncomfortable. And, not everybody, not all the time, and so on. But you see that a lot. It's a pretty common pattern if you look out for it. And so the thing, if they were to apply the skepticism to everything, they would then start to see, what levels of confidence do I actually need to have? What do I need to have, reflectively? And you can start to build a real philosophy. Because Chesterton had a really great quote, which I'm probably going to mangle, but which amounts to everybody needs a philosophy. You can't live life without a philosophy. So if you won't actually think things through yourself, you're going to be just using instead the scraps of somebody else's philosophy, generally that you haven't thought through at all. And that's what you see all over the internet, in a great many places, that people are just sort of using these scraps of somebody else's philosophy rather than having actually come up with one themselves. And so, in conclusion, that's the thing to realize about the weakness of skepticism. Not that people shouldn't be skeptical, because in fact, I think people should be a lot more skeptical. They should be skeptical of themselves. They should be skeptical of what they like. They should be skeptical of their comfort. And they should be skeptical of skepticism. And once you've done all that, then you can use that as a tool while you then go on the much harder task of figuring out how to build something up positive into gaining actual knowledge and wisdom. So that's, I think, the best way to look at it. That skepticism is a tool. It's a very useful tool in your toolbox. It can be very helpful in certain conditions, but it is by no means a philosophy of life. And it's best used as a way of helping to build a proper philosophy of life. And it's something it's never gotten rid of, but it's something that is used at best, I think, to defend the more constructive work that one needs to do. So that's the thing about anyone, the conclusion sort of advice for people who are being skeptical. Do it for real. Do it sincerely. Apply it rigorously. And then realize that you need to be doing something else too. Something constructive, something positive. And I'm not telling people jump for Christianity straight. I mean, you'll be best off if you do, but by all means, just study the Greeks. Study, some philosophers who actually tried to come to correct conclusions about life. Study people who tried to build up wisdom, because you can find those in the pagan world, as well as in the Christian. As I said, Christianity being true, if you skip straight to Christianity, you'll save yourself a lot of time, but you do what you can, not what you can't, and some people can't go straight there, so start someplace you can start, like, with the pagans. You might even start, by looking up what the actual skeptics, the original skeptics, the Greek skeptics, actually did, because they didn't just say no to everything. And then look up some others too, like the Stoics and so on. You'll probably be surprised by what you find, but in any event, you'll find some very useful stuff. So, until next time, may you hit everything you aim at.